remember one time after the war, I was about 12. My father had a job in a factory across the way. And because he had lost his leg, he had a stump and a wooden artificial leg. And in the summer, and there's nothing quite as ferocious as a New York August, he would work on this assembly line 8 hours a day, and he was home that night, and I heard him weeping in the dark around 1 o'clock in the morning. And I knew that no matter what I ever did, I couldn't articulate it exactly, that I had to honor that pain, that you must honor that. And I think that's what the children of immigrants do, all of us. We know what they gave up. They gave up their countries. In some cases, they gave up their languages. They worked at the lousiest, rottenest jobs in order to put food on our tables. We have to honor that for the rest of our lives.
In early December 1883, a 34-year-old German Jewish poet named Emma Lazarus, appalled by the recent upsurge of anti-Semitic violence in Russia, submitted a 14-line poem to help the faltering fundraising campaign for the pedestal of the Statue of Liberty. The liberty her sonnet celebrated had nothing to do with the abstract political ideals the French had intended. It was liberty as a beacon of hope, shining out to oppressed peoples around the world. It was the future, reaching out to the present, to unchain humanity from the shackles of the past.
The promise of New York to anybody who comes here is the promise of Emma Lazarus at the Statue of Liberty. And there is a reason that that poem, which structurally and in terms of the words used, could be thought to be very sentimental. Certainly it is. And then it contains something. The test of that poem is that it is true. And these huddled masses yearning to be free did come here, and we did make them free. In fact, no matter who you are, at some point in your life, hearing those words or reading those words, just thinking of those words, your eyes will fill with tears. And what makes you tearful is that truth.
Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. The wretched refuse of your teeming shores, send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. I'll never forget those words.
Emma Lazarus herself never saw the statue her poem so movingly commemorated, or the epic human tide it foretold. Traveling in Europe during the final months of the statue's construction, she was diagnosed with Hodgkin's disease. Passing through the harbor on her way home in the summer of 1887, she was too ill and weak even to come on deck. She died in her home in Manhattan 3 months later, at the age of 38. More than 15 years later, on May 6, 1903, a bronze plaque inscribed with her stirring words was finally affixed to the base of the statue. It would take decades more for Americans to realize the full meaning of the gift the French had given them.
Not like the brazen giant of Greek fame, with conquering limbs astride from land to land. Here at our sea-washed sunset gates shall stand a mighty woman with a torch, whose flame is the imprisoned lightning, and her name, Mother of Exiles. From her beacon hand glows worldwide welcome. Her mild eyes command the air-bridged harbor that Twin Cities frame. Keep, ancient lands, your storied pomp, cries she with silent lips. Give me your tired, You're poor. Your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. The wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed, to me. I lift my light beside the golden door. Emma Lazarus.
At 2 o'clock on the afternoon of May 11th, 1896, a photographer named William Hayes hoisted a strange-looking camera up onto a tripod at the southern end of Herald Square. Passers-by assumed he was about to expose a glass plate negative. But the cumbersome apparatus, the latest invention of Hayes's employer, Thomas Alva Edison, did not take still pictures. Instead, exposing one frame after another, each just an instant apart from the next, 16 times a second, it was capable of capturing for the first time the speed and vitality of urban life.
People were terrified. When they first saw these images, they had no idea what they were. They had just brief 15, 30-second shots of things, but they hand-tinted some of them to be color. They did have this one film of a wall of water just rushing at you, and people got up in a panic and stormed out of the theater. I mean, just charged out of the theater because they thought that, the wall had broken down and there was some kind of tidal wave coming through the wall.
Mesmerized by the kinetic energy of New York, the first cameramen carried their equipment everywhere, shooting short films they called actualities. Real-life views of actual places and events. Most had no plots and no characters, and most lasted only a minute or two. But audiences everywhere flocked to see them, enthralled by the spectacle of the city itself, which by 1900 had become the greatest show on earth. What the cameras revealed was a city that now had the world's busiest harbor, the world's biggest ships and longest bridges, the worst slums and grandest mansions. It had a statue 15 stories tall and a park 840 acres in size. It had trains that ran 100 feet above the ground and leapt across rivers. Though the films sometimes captured grand civic ceremonies and great public events, the most effective were those of daily life. Entranced, as Walt Whitman had been, by the humblest and most ordinary of moments. A trolley moving down the street. A windy day. A woman's smile. The new motion pictures conveyed, as nothing else had, the mystery and beauty and democratic glory of the modern world.
Motion pictures come into play and they record the city, and they record it in such a way that make it even seem more exciting than it was. But certainly they capture the image of the city in motion as it had never been captured in the still photographs of an Underwood or Byron, who often had to photograph on a Sunday morning because the film moved so slow that if a cart moved by, you'd see it as a shadowy thing. Suddenly you catch that cart moving and see the New York traffic. And suddenly people become enthralled with what, in a certain way, they were rebelling against the 19th century. Traffic itself, density itself.
And yet, even as motion and change became a way of life in Manhattan, an even greater transformation was underway. Between 1898 and 1913, the human and physical and political landscape of the city would be transformed beyond recognition. During that time, the entire world would arrive on the city's doorstep, and most of those who came would be changed utterly by what they found there. But in the end, nothing would be more moving or prove to have more lasting consequences for the city and the nation than the changes the newcomers themselves would bring to the life of New York City. In little more than a decade, the 20th century itself would be born on the streets of New York, and nothing would ever be the same again.
Well, I think one of the great things about New York is it's not a static thing. It's not New York is. New York is always becoming. It's becoming physically as buildings are torn down and changed, much more so than any other American city. But it's also always becoming in terms of what it is in something we can't see, in the culture of the city. So the immigrants came to New York City, especially in these large numbers between the 1880s and 1920s, and made it their own. Made it a kind of place that the world had never seen before. Made it where there were more Italians in New York than there were in Naples. I mean, there were more Irish than in Dublin, more Greeks than in Athens. It was an incredible experience because the city was so vast and so many of these immigrants were there that the city was open to these changes. So that even today, what is New York? It's more than a mosaic. It's a new kind of city.
If you were living in New York in those years at the turn of the century, you knew it was happening right there in front of you, in your village. And of course, it disturbed many people. Didn't like it. They thought it was going to ruin the country, and they were wrong.
It began in the 1880s, spurred on by poverty and persecution, by financial panic and political upheaval, by family strife and personal woe. They came not from Northern Europe this time, but from the East and from the South. Italians, Jews, Greeks, and Poles, Russians, Hungarians, Ukrainians, Armenians, and Turks. Out of the remote and little-known reaches of Europe, one awestruck observer wrote, marches a vast and endless army.
It was a huge human tide, and coming on all the time, year after year, and growing. In 1907, 1,200,000 people, 1,200,000 people came into the city of New York from Europe, primarily. There were 289,000 of them from Italy alone, 256,000 from Russia, just in 1 year. And in the long run, they gave us more than they got.
One way or the other, they had all heard the same thing. There was freedom and opportunity in America for anyone willing to work. And the place with the most jobs was the sprawling, unfathomably large seaport of New York. For most, it meant leaving everything familiar behind.
The day I left home, my mother came with me to the railroad station. When we said goodbye, she said it was like seeing me go into my casket. I never saw her again. Yulia Goniprov, 1899.
There was a sense that the city, a message that the city whispered to its people and to people from all over the United States. You know, come here, everything is possible. Now, that's a seductive sound. It's a seductive whisper. And a lot of people failed at it, but at least the promise was there.
There's always been a feeling of promise in New York. And the promise is there because it is the entrance city. It's the beginning. But I still think of it as a city to which, as James Joyce said about his characters, here comes everybody.
About 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning, we all got up. The whole boat bent toward her because everybody went out. Everybody. She was beautiful, with the sunshine so bright and so big, and everybody was crying. The captain came and said, "Please, everybody, we should move a little bit to the center." But nobody would move.
The thrill was unbelievable, but always the fear, because you have to go through Ellis Island. I heard all kinds of things that they would tell you on the boat. My God, I said, I hope they're not going to send me back. Joseph DeLacy.
For decades, immigrants to New York had come through Castle Garden, a ramshackle state-run depot at the foot of Manhattan. But by 1890, the one-time concert hall had been completely overwhelmed by the tidal wave of new immigrants. And work had begun on a massive new federal installation, far out in the harbor, on an abandoned ammunition dump called Ellis Island. On December 17th, 1900, the massive complex of brick, stone, and steel was finally complete. Built to accommodate 500,000 people a year, it was soon handling twice that number, sometimes as many as 12,000 a day. In 30 years, 12 million people would stream through the great echoing registry room, hoping to find sanctuary and a new beginning in America. More than 4 million of them would settle permanently in New York, tripling its population in less than a single lifetime.
Immigration made us huge. You could never have bred yourself into 8 million people in 50 years. Immigration did it. It also made for an industrial city. The people who were arriving were from the farms in the main, arriving here in curious reversals. It was when the wheat from Kansas began arriving in the Baltic that peasant population there became surplus. They turned around and arrived here.
On disembarking, the Pilgrims entered a vast, bewildering, impersonal machine, an assembly line for processing immigrants. With numbered tags pinned to their clothes, they were swiftly herded into long lines, then ushered inside the main building by harried immigration officials, who barked orders at them in dozens of different tongues. Inspectors were required by law to turn back polygamists, paupers, criminals, and the mentally ill, as well as anyone with a heart condition, or a physical disability, or a contagious disease. The inspections were brusque, irreversible, and carried out with astonishing speed. On the busiest days, the examiners had less than 6 seconds to detect any one of 60 conditions. The unlucky ones were swiftly removed from the line without explanation and sent to special examination rooms with chalk letters hastily scrawled on their coats. L for lameness, C for conjunctivitis, H for heart problems, X for suspected insanity. The examination for trachoma, an incurable disease of the eye, was particularly traumatic. Anyone infected was sent back. 25-year-old Fiorello LaGuardia, working as an interpreter on Ellis Island to pay his way through law school, never forgot the harrowing scenes that ensued.
Sometimes, if it was a young child who suffered from trachoma, one of the parents had to return to the native country with the rejected member of the family. When they learned their fate, they were stunned. They had never felt ill. They had never heard the word trachoma. They could see all right, and they had no homes to return to. Fiorello LaGuardia.
For the majority who passed the medical exam, the last hurdle was the registry room, where the final interrogation was held. The nearest earthly likeness, one man said, to the final day of judgment. In rapid succession, each immigrant was asked to state his or her name, place of birth, destination, and occupation, how much money he or she had, whether he or she had ever been in jail or had ever been an anarchist. No immigrant's name was ever known to have been changed by the inspectors at Ellis Island, who merely confirmed information already before them in the ship's manifest. For 80% of the newcomers, the harrowing experience was over in 4 or 5 hours. And in the end, fewer than 1 in 50 were denied entrance to America. Without ceremony or congratulation, the new arrivals were curtly waved down a flight of stairs toward the exit, where, at a place called the Kissing Post, after separations that had sometimes lasted months or years, they were finally met by family and friends.
The Italian kisses his little children, but scarcely speaks to his wife. The Hungarian and Slavish people put their arms around one another and weep. The Jew of all countries kisses his wife and children as though he had all the kisses in the world and intended to use them all up quick.
Most of the immigrants quickly dispersed to distant towns and cities around the country. But for 1 in 4 of the new arrivals, the final destination was a 15-minute ferry ride away, on an island many of them would never leave again. On board the ferry, approaching the battery, they stood in wonder at the last and most extraordinary sight of all. An astonishing vision that seemed to corroborate everything they hoped the new world might be.
Everybody was looking at Manhattan, and I must admit, that sight I don't think I will ever forget.
I thought I was in heaven. My God, was this a city on earth or a city in heaven?
The word skyscraper, which you associate with Manhattan, that's a sailor's term. It's the uppermost sail on a three-mast rigged ship crossing over from Liverpool.
Newcomers approaching Manhattan as the century came to a close were greeted by an astonishing sight. Down at the tip of the island, from the narrow lanes the Dutch had laid out 3 centuries before, New York City had begun to soar straight up into the sky. It is as if some mighty force were astir beneath the ground, one man wrote, pushing up structures that a dozen years ago would have been inconceivable. Not since the advent of the great Gothic cathedrals 800 years before had there been such a revolution in the way men built.
What happened in the city of New York when the skyscraper was born is that buildings turned from crustaceans, which are supported by their walls, to vertebrates supported by their skeleton. But the skeleton had to be made out of steel. It's one of the great transforming moments in how we live on Earth as human beings. And suddenly, up out of this granite base of New York City, this island in the sea, and remember the East River is the sea, it's a tidal strait, it isn't really a river at all. Up out of that rises this new form, which is entirely American. And there it was for all the world to see when they came arriving at our doorstep.
Well, what was new about them was there was 2 pieces of technology came together and made them technically possible. One was the electric elevator, and the other was steel. A masonry building, the walls, the thickness of the walls is a factor of how high you can build the building, and if it gets very high, the walls are so thick at the base, there's no room for using the building. I mean, it's like a pyramid, which, by the way, was the tallest building in the world up until the end of the 19th century.
The reason the great skyscrapers went up in Manhattan is that Manhattan is an island of very powerful bedrock. It's granite and basically very, very high density rock that frankly digging foundations is unbelievably difficult. You have to blast to build in Manhattan. And the buildings went up in Manhattan because of the power of that bedrock. Once you dig that foundation, and when they dig, they really dig, they dig with dynamite. And once you dynamite out and you secure that foundation, that building isn't going anywhere.
With the advent of the elevator and steel frame construction, the low-slung 4-story skyline of New York shot up with startling speed. Beginning with the 11-story tower building, called the Idiotic Building by skeptical New Yorkers, who on stormy days during its construction gathered at a safe distance and waited for it to collapse. It did not, and less than a year after it opened in 1888, it was surpassed by the World Building, which climbed the unthinkable height of 18 stories. Stepping off on the top floor, one awestruck visitor called out loudly, "Is God in?" With each passing year, as the number and size of corporations headquartered in Lower Manhattan increased, the demand for space intensified. Limited as to the ground, business seeks the air, the journalist Lincoln Steffens wrote. Confined on all sides, the only way out is up.
Once that process starts, moreover, there's a whole other set of meanings that get attributed to skyscrapers. Corporations love them because they are emblems. They are like registering their landmark in the sky over Manhattan. People use those buildings as corporate logos, as sources of identity in this new corporate marketplace.
Year after year, taller and taller buildings soared into the sky, the most tangible outward expression of the mighty economic engine, now drawing in people from every corner of the world. Americans have practically added a new dimension to space, one Scottish visitor wrote. When they find themselves a little crowded, they simply tilt a street on end and call it a skyscraper. In 1903, the 21-story Fuller Building went up at the corner of 5th Avenue and 23rd Street, soon known as the Flatiron Building for its unusual shape. 5 years later, the Singer Building leapt up, twice as tall as the Flatiron. It was surpassed only 18 months later by the 50-story Metropolitan Life Building on Madison Square. By then, there were 550 structures over 10 stories tall in Lower Manhattan, whose soaring skyline had changed forever the meaning of the word city.
But there's something, last thing, that's more intangible. What you've got is a civic culture which is enthralled with this development and incredibly supportive of it. New Yorkers love these buildings. They wax rhapsodic about them. They develop new metaphors of these glorious mountains rising over the sky. There's a sense that New York is on the cutting edge of global civilization. All of the old wonders of the world were in Europe, the old-fashioned stuff, but now the new frontier of mankind is in the sky over Manhattan.
Remember that Lower Manhattan in particular, but even all of Manhattan, has this great advantage, even before airplanes, that you can get back from it and see it. You can take a picture of it. You can thrill people as they arrive from Europe. Not only immigrants, they didn't care about them, but all those rich people getting off all those liners. They look up and see Lower Manhattan. They say, what's that building? The Bankers Trust Company. What's that building? The Singer Sewing Machine Company. What a symbol. What an advertisement.
Gigantic, colossal, enormous, daring. There are no words. Words are inadequate to this apparition, this landscape. which the vast river serves as frame for the display of still vaster human energy. Reaching such a pitch of collective effort, this energy has become a force of nature itself. It is the poetry of democracy, an immense concert. This is not the Parthenon, that little temple on a little hill. It is the obscure and tremendous poetry of the modern world, and it gives you a tragic shudder. There is in it so much of mad and willful humanity. Paul Bourget.
On a freezing cold day in early January 1904, with the temperature hovering at 15 below zero, 30-year-old Al Smith arrived in Albany to be sworn in for his first term in the New York State Legislature. The hard-working young man from the Lower East Side of New York was shocked by his reception in the Capitol, which was even more frigid than the weather. All through his first term, ignored by senior members and passed over again and again for committee assignments, he sat silently in the last row of the high-ceilinged chamber, bewildered by the intricacies of the legislative process and daunted by Albany's elaborate political rituals. During his entire first session in the Assembly, he did not make a single speech.
Not only was he not educated, because he didn't have much schooling, but he didn't like to read. And he once said the only book he ever read all the way through in his life was The Life of John L. Sullivan. But he taught himself state government by simply reading every bill that he could read until the late hours of the night, night after night. People started to listen to him because somehow all these assemblymen realized, because he had been reading all these bills, that no matter what the subject was, this guy Smith knew about it. He had a grasp of state government that no one else had.
Slowly but surely, he began to make a name for himself. As his influence grew, and his confidence, he spoke more and more often from the floor of the Assembly, with the easy comic charm of a natural-born actor, on subjects he had mastered in stunning detail. In 1908, as his reputation grew, Silent Charlie Murphy, the boss of Tammany Hall, came up to get a better look at his rapidly rising young star.
Murphy's reaction to Smith is fascinating. He'd never had a conversation with him. And when he realized that Smith might be something very special, he called him in for a long talk, and he had a couple of his advisors there. And at the end of the talk, one of the advisors said to Silent Charlie, "You know, Al Smith never went to college." And Murphy looked at him and said, if he went to college, he wouldn't be Al Smith.
By his third term, he was beginning to enjoy himself in Albany. More and more often now, he threw dinner parties for his colleagues at Keeler's restaurant on State Street, regaling them with tales from his childhood on the Lower East Side. By then, the old neighborhood in the Fourth Ward, in the shadow of the Brooklyn Bridge, had been changed beyond recognition by the tremendous influx of newcomers.
Every 4 years, New York adds to itself a city the size of Boston or St. Louis. It is the largest Jewish city in the world, the largest Irish city, one of the largest German cities. More than 700,000 Russians call it home, and it houses more Italians than Rome. New York is the great whirlpool of the races. Edwin Hill.
No city was more appropriate to become the immigrant metropolis than New York. From the time of initial Dutch settlement in the 1620s, all through the 17th and 18th and 19th centuries. By any comparison in the world, New York was a multicultural, multi-ethnic, heterogeneous metropolis. it had already established a kind of a tradition of openness to newcomers, of never having a single dominant culture. But still, when you think about the incredible migration between, let's say, roughly 1880 and 1925, when millions of people come to the city, not just come to the United States, come through New York City every year, and they transform the city.
Even by the standards the city itself had set, the mammoth influx of peoples was without precedent in world history. By 1905, 4 out of 5 New Yorkers were now either the children of immigrants or immigrants themselves. No fewer than 70% of the city's public school children had been born outside the country. Forever after, many Americans would view New York as a kind of foreign country.
By 1900, the Lower East Side was, at least to an American, was not an American place, because it was strange babble of tongues of Eastern European Jews, or Little Italies had sprung up. Completely ethnic neighborhoods that were not separate unto themselves, but if you'd been walking on the streets, it would have been hard to tell what country you were in at the time.
Most of Elizabeth Street was Sicilian, came from Sicily. And what that means is that a couple of the immigrants came over on a boat, 1901, 1902, 1910, and they were lucky enough to get a job, and luckier to get 2 rooms. They used to call them rooms, not apartments, in the tenements. What was happening at 232 Elizabeth Street was that people from one town in Sicily were coming in and staying in that one building. So that 232 became Cimina, which is a beautiful town outside of Palermo that my mother's mother comes from. Now, 241 across the street, the same thing was happening, but mainly from people from Polizzi Generosa, which is also outside of Palermo, but higher in the mountains. That's my father's father comes from. So they were across the street, and when my mother said that she met my father, there was a problem because there were different nationalities. She used the phrase different nationalities, and in reality it's just from different villages, really.
In coming to New York, the immigrants had not only crossed an ocean, they had, in most cases, exchanged an ancient way of life for the most modern and frenetic environment on Earth. The old village might have been wretched, the writer Irving Howe later said, but it was a thoroughly known place where one's ancestors lay buried. It did not loom up to terrifying heights. It required no special knowledge of machines in shops or on trolleys, and it seldom had much to do with the rigors of the clock.
I think that there is a tremendous sense as well of people making a leap from, in many cases, life that was like the Middle Ages into the most modern cosmopolis in the world. I mean, think about these people coming from places like Russia or Poland, in which life was really not all that different than it had been a couple of hundred years ago. Then you're coming to New York, where you're in the most modern city of the world. You're making an enormous leap into modernity.
The Jews who come at the time come from a million different places, though mostly from Eastern Europe. And you have people from every class in society coming. You have people who were rich in the old country and who lost it all. And then you have people who are in the middle and who come with a little bit of property, and then the most people come with nothing. All they come with is their capacity for labor power and the ideas in their heads and their capacity to think. And Hegel says that's the most important kind of capital for modern man, the capacity to think. And if you've got that, you can make up for everything else that you don't have.
The question is, how does it come that New York attracted all of this energy, was able to channel all this energy? And one is the geography thing. 2 is the energy of the people who were here, who brought with them generations of pent-up unfulfillment from where they came from. The Irish had been put down in Ireland for a long time, so they came here and by God, they were going to make it in America. They were going to show what the Irish really could do. And then the Germans who came were not the Germans who were happy at home. They were the Germans who were ticked off at home. But if you put all the Chinese or all the Eastern European Jews or all the Irish in the city, and they are in concentrated areas, and they're 5-7 stories high and miserable housing, they have to be out on the streets, and they have to be struggling to do something better so they can get out of that awful housing. well, that's your engine.
Often when they came, they were shocked to discover that this wasn't what they thought it would be. And there are plenty of accounts of immigrants talking about life on the Lower East Side as being so far away from what they imagined the land of dollars to be, or the streets paved with gold. There's a great deal of sorrow and sense of loss for many immigrants.
By 1900, the most crowded neighborhoods in the world are in New York City, especially on the Lower East Side, but also in East Harlem. Conditions were abysmal. We don't need to exaggerate when we say that it's possible that housing conditions in New York City, certainly crowding, exceeded anything that the world has ever known before or since.
Crowded into stifling, often lightless tenements, immigrants escaped whenever they could to the street. Block after block, from long before dawn until long after dark, the streets were one vast, raucous, open-air bazaar, teeming with peddlers and vendors of every kind, hawking their wares from the sidewalks or from pushcarts, rented for 10 cents a day. By 1900, the streets of the Lower East Side were jammed with more than 25,000 pushcarts, which sold everything from vegetables to pots and pans, shoelaces, bolts of cloth, tools, and crockery. In the poorest wards, peddlers sold goods in minute quantities: a single candle, the wing of a chicken, one egg, or just the yolk of one egg.
Forget your past, your customs, your ideals. Select a goal and pursue it with all your might. You will experience a bad time, but sooner or later, you will achieve your goal. A bit of advice for you. Do not take a moment's rest. Run, do, work, and keep your own good in mind. A final virtue is needed in America, called cheek. Do not say, I cannot, I do not know. G.M. Price.
You take whatever is available to survive. People can get sanctimonious about immigrant groups and what they do, but they do what they have to do to survive. That's also a law of the city. It is a law from the beginning and it will be at the end. And that's not always going to work on Wall Street because that's not accessible to people. Cities are also about people coming from one environment and really making a tremendous adjustment into another and doing what they have to do to survive. That is not often a pretty picture in cities, or not always a pretty picture.
Nobody dragged them here. Nobody brought them here in chains. They came exhilarated by what was here, by the possibility of it. In my case, my parents are both Catholics from Belfast. So the sense that their children and they themselves could function in a place where nobody was going to ask their religion was amazing. The case of the Jews is, of course, the great example. You know, to go in one generation from the shtetl to have your kids graduate from universities in one generation, amazing. And that energy, that challenge, the questioning that goes on with someone who's new, saying, why is that here? Why does it work that way? Why do you do it that way? What if we do it this way? That kind of energy, I think, was the essence of it.
For most, the process of assimilation took place with remarkable speed. In less than a single generation, in just 10 years on average, most families on the Lower East Side had moved up or on.
The Jews start a little bit higher in the sense that they come with skills, needle trades often, and a little bit more money in their pocket, and rise higher. But the Italians also rise rapidly. So that what you have in this cauldron down in Lower Manhattan, you have these groups making an astonishing change in the space of a single generation or two, so that New York is what it was advertised. It was a city of opportunity, and the nation was. Rags to riches, no. But to get a solid job, to get a foothold in the land, to change from that peasant status that you'd known. New York turns out to be the best place in the United States to do that between about 1880 and certainly 1925.
The absolute demand of the city that you get to know each other, because you had to. You couldn't really stay in a ghetto and function. You had to leave the ghetto to go to work. You had to go to Manhattan. You had to go to Midtown. You had to go uptown. You had to go down, wherever it was. People moved, and the subway then became one of these great binding elements in the city that moved people around and put them up against each other. And sometimes they came up against each other in conflict, but the conflict didn't ever last very long. The Irish fought the Italians until they started marrying them. And then they both fought the Jews until they started marrying them.
It's a constant negotiation. How much will I let go of who I have been, and how much will I take on of a new persona? And that is true within a family, and is true for an individual. Parents wanting the children to maintain traditions that have helped define their own lives from their own culture, their own religious group, their own racial group, their own language group. And the children wanting to be American. And that often to the children means sloughing off these other, what they would consider vestiges of the old ways. For the parents, this is who we are. This conflict is set up.
We have to be Americans. We shall be. We shall learn English. We shall love America and help to build America. We shall accomplish in the new world 100 times more than we could in the old. But you will not be able to erase the old home from your heart. The heart will be drawn elsewhere. And in your solitude, images will rise up and stare in your faces with eternal sorrow. Abraham Cahan.
What is a New Yorker? Is he Jew or Irish? Is he English or German? Is he Russian or Polish? He may be something of all these, and yet he is wholly none of them. Something has been added which he had not before. He is quicker in his movement, less trammeled in his judgment. Though he may lose wisdom in sharpening his wit, the change is unmistakable. New York, indeed, resembles a magic cauldron. Those cast into it are born again. Charles Whibble.
The astonishing phenomena is that these people are attracted because there are job possibilities here, and to an amazing extent, the job possibilities are involved in providing the goods and services for the newcomers who are arriving. What you set up is this astonishing self-fulfilling, feeding on itself state of affairs. But there's also the fundamental fact of what's making the economy go. The port is exploding. And as the port explodes, partly because all those immigrants are coming in, those immigrants are the ones who are working on loading the goods and services.
By 1900, the millions of newcomers pouring into New York were propelling an era of expansion and physical growth without precedent in the city's history. In the years to come, in little more than a decade, they would fill out and then draw together the 5 separate boroughs of the metropolis, transforming New York along the way into the most modern city on earth.
One of the things that drove people crazy was that you've now got this huge greater New York, 370-odd square miles, and the vast majority of the population is huddled in Manhattan and down the Lower East Side. The Bronx, at the time of consolidation, was still a rural backwater. The question is, how are you going to make consolidation real? It's like Hamilton said, you can write a constitution, but it's a piece of paper. How are you going to make it real? You've still got, Manhattan and Brooklyn and all these sort of scattered areas. How are you going to, in fact, integrate them? What happens is an explosion of connectivity. What you've got is, most dramatically, the subway system. The subways are, in fact, the thing that really make consolidation real and viable. Here, within an incredibly short space of time, there were an underground set of linkages pulling the dispersed geographical territory together.
To me, the real essence of New York City is the subway system. That the modern city as we know it is impossible to conceive without this underground kind of tether of tunnels. Part of which makes New York, New York, in fact much of it, is invisible to the eye above the streets because everything is moving below the ground and making possible that congestion and that intensity that you can see. Without that, which you cannot see, which can see, would be much less impressive.
New Yorkers will never go into a hole in the ground, one financier confidently declared. But by 1900, the city had let out a contract for construction, and work had begun. Operated by a private firm called the Interborough Rapid Transit Company, the mammoth project was under the direction of a wealthy German Jew named August Belmont, whose father had changed the family name from Schoenberg and become one of the richest men in New York. In 4 years, Belmont's army of 7,700 men, most of them Italian immigrants, would cut more than 20 miles of subway tunnel, threading their way through a tangle of underground pipes and conduits to build the most modern transportation system in the world.
There was nothing revolutionary about any single piece of the building of the New York City subway. London had a subway before that. There were no great engineering breakthroughs. What was extraordinary is that the subway system was built, or at least the heart of it, in just 4 years, while the busiest city in North America continued to operate. So the speed and audacity of this project, by modern standards, is really rather awesome. Because this required opening up streets. Most of the subway was built by what they called cut and covers. They would dig a trench, build walls to it, lay the foundations for what will be the track level, and then put the ceiling, which is the street, essentially back on it, and do this right in the heart of Manhattan. So it had 1,000 individual challenges. And then, of course, there was one conceptual breakthrough, which was the express train, which was a innovation of the New York City subway system, which allowed enormously rapid travel from distant points into the center of the city.
The very concept of an express subway train is totally un-European. In Paris, there is only one train on a line going in each direction. Here we have local trains, express trains. We have the most complicated subway line. It's like a national railroad underground with the trains that go to Harlem. Some trains go up Broadway, some go to Brooklyn, some terminate at City Hall. You don't find that in Paris. You don't find that in London. It's all rather boring and single-minded.
So when it opens in 1904, it is overnight the most extensive subway system in the world, and it remains so until long after World War II. By some measures, it's still the world's most extensive subway system.
Just 4 years after construction had begun, the system was ready to begin service. On October 27, 1904, in an exquisitely tiled station 30 feet beneath City Hall, Mayor George B. McClellan, the son of the famous Civil War general, was presented a ceremonial silver motorman's handle, along with the honor of starting up the train for its first official run. As worried engineers looked on, the mayor quickly throttled the 8-car train up to full power, rocketing north through the Bleecker Street station at 45 miles an hour. When the chief engineer suggested he relinquish the controls, the exhilarated mayor roared back, "I'm running this train now," and pushed onto 103rd Street, 7 miles to the north. Finally, at 7 that evening, after an endless series of ceremonial rides and an hour-long safety inspection, the chief engineer gave the signal, and the subway was opened to the public.
For the first time in his life, Father Knickerbocker went underground yesterday, to the number of 150,000, amid the tooting and whistles and the firing of salutes. The official train made its run exactly on time, arriving at 146th Street in exactly 26 minutes. And all along the way, crowds of excited New Yorkers were collected around the little entrances, talking about the trains that they knew were dashing below. The New York Herald.
The fare was a nickel.
What a nickel does is subsidize outer development. Unlike the situation in Europe, where the amount you pay is a function of the distance you are traveling. In New York, as elsewhere in the United States, we had a single fare. That has enormous implications. That means that if you want a house for your family, it does not cost you any more to move out. That explodes the size of the city. Even now, you have the longest subway ride in the world. I think the A train, it's more than 30 miles from one end to the other. It cost you, well, now it's a little more, but it was a nickel ride for half a century. An incredible statistic.
Traveling from one end of the sprawling metropolis to the other, people soon forgot what life had been like without it. Within a decade, New York's subway system was carrying nearly 1 billion passengers a year, opening the vast reaches of the entire consolidated city to all New Yorkers.
Within a period of 15, 20 years, the Bronx was the 6th largest city in the United States, if you counted it in its own right. What happens now is that there is a vast exodus out of Manhattan and into these outer boroughs. They pour across the new bridges into Brooklyn and Queens, and they take the new subways up to the Bronx.
The subway system does a couple of things. It gives access to all the wonders of the metropolis, if you want to use that kind of a phrase, to the working population of the city as well as its upper and middle classes. So everything from the woods of Van Cortlandt Park to the ocean beaches of Coney Island to the lights of Times Square to the city colleges to the cheap concerts are now available for only a dime round trip to the population of New York.
Even as the new underground tether of steel drew the far-flung reaches of the city together, a frenzy of construction went on above ground, linking the boroughs even more tightly. By 1909, in just 6 years, 3 more bridges had been thrown across the East River. By then, electrified railroads had made possible what steam engines could never do, connecting the island, for the first time since the Ice Age, to the mainland of the North American continent.
For many, many years, most of the railroads got to the Hudson River and stopped dead. I mean, the iron horses kind of pawing the water impotently. But now you get Pennsylvania Railroad driving tunnels underneath the Hudson, connecting tunnels out to Long Island and on to New England, building Penn Station right in the middle of those things. And the city is not only consolidated, but, connected.
To crown the arrival of the 2 great railways in New York, twin stations, the greatest ever built in the world, now arose just 12 blocks apart from each other in Midtown Manhattan.
At the beginning of this century, New York's imperial age, we built 2 imperial railroad terminals, Grand Central for the New York Central Railroad and Pennsylvania Station for the Pennsylvania Railroad, which had built a tunnel under the Hudson, came up at 34th Street. A great architectural firm, McKim, Mead, and White, designed this. They used as their model the baths of Caracalla in Rome, these incredible domed affairs, and it was a joy.
Pennsylvania Station was the first to open in 1910 at 7th Avenue and 33rd Street. It was, the New York Times declared, the largest and handsomest train station in the world, built to last for all time, and proof, one awestruck observer said, that New York had come of age. Just 3 years later, Grand Central Terminal opened its doors for the first time at the corner of 42nd Street and Park Avenue. High atop the structure's monumental south facade soared a 40-foot-tall statue of Mercury, the winged god of speed. Inside, the massive barrel-vaulted ceiling, spangled with dozens of electric stars, showing all the constellations of the night sky, seemed to go on forever.
The grandeur, the folly of the architecture, the enormous waste of space, so the sheer gorgeous volume of space that you're in there, you know, which of course I lift up my eyes on the hills. He says I lift up my eyes to that sky inside, and of course the continuous expression of vitality and having 60 or 80,000 people pouring through back and forth all day long through the thing. It's like a sea back and forth all day long, and in the old days all night long.
Here is this great public room. All you do is catch a train in both of them, and they were splendid. And these rooms, and particularly Pennsylvania Station, it was in the classical language. It went back directly to ancient Rome. It was a language of architecture that almost everyone, at least from Europe, who was an immigrant to America, could understand. So in that sense, it was truly democratic. You didn't have to ask where the railroad station was. If you got anywhere near it, you could just look, and that had to be the railroad station. Nothing more grand could be.
The station was murmurous with the immense and distant sound of time. Great slanted beams of moted light fell ponderously athwart the station's floor, and the calm voice of time hovered along the walls and ceiling of that mighty room, distilled out of the voices and movements of the people who swarmed beneath. Here, as nowhere else on earth, men were brought together for a moment, at the beginning or end of their innumerable journeys. Here one saw their greetings and farewells. Here, in a single instant, one got the entire picture of human destiny. Men came and went, they passed and vanished. All were moving through the moments of their lives. But the voice of time remained aloof and unperturbed, a drowsy and eternal murmur below the immense and distant roof. Thomas Wolfe.
By 1909, the concentration of human and economic forces in New York was reaching an astonishing peak. 2 years before, Ellis Island had experienced the busiest single day in its history, when in less than 12 hours, 11,747 immigrants were admitted to the country. Fully 40% of the city's population was now foreign-born. Immense new ocean liners, 8 stories tall and 800 feet long, capable of transporting 3,000 people at a time, most in steerage, now berthed where Henry Hudson's ship, the Half Moon, had once ridden at anchor. In September 1909, exactly 300 years after Hudson first sailed into the harbor, and a century after Robert Fulton launched his steamboat off the west side of Manhattan, New York held the greatest birthday party in its history. Called the Hudson-Fulton Celebration, it was a triumphant affirmation of the mighty metropolis that had risen so spectacularly from the sea. For 10 days, hundreds of thousands of New Yorkers lined the waterfront to watch an immense procession of ships streaming in and out of the harbor, and to catch their first glimpse of an airplane piloted by Wilbur Wright himself, circling within 25 feet of the Statue of Liberty. The climax came on a brilliantly clear autumn night in early October, when 1 million incandescent lights provided by the Edison Company turned the bridges, ships, and tall towers of New York into a glittering city of fire.
The city was one long banner of light that sparkled and scintillated in the crisp night air, paling even to insignificance a moon of harvest splendor. There were electric wonders for all to gape at. tall buildings, enough to send their shafts of molten splendor where all might see, and searchlights enough to streak the sky wherever crowds were gathered. The New York Times.
Never again would the fires of capitalism burn quite so brightly in New York City. Never again would so many people be gathered together on the island of Manhattan, which in less than a year would reach its peak population of 2.3 million people. 6 weeks after the Hudson-Fulton celebration ended, tens of thousands of New Yorkers would take to the streets again, not in celebration this time, but to protest the appalling suffering and stunning inequalities that had haunted the city for almost a century. By November, pitched battles were being waged in the streets between striking factory workers and the police, as New York's poorest citizens rose up to protest the heartbreaking extremes of the capitalist system and the failure of the government to do anything about them.
I think New York became an arena in which a fundamental question facing America was explored, which is, what is the meaning of democracy in a society of modern industrial structures and great economic inequality? How can you continue to have the formal structures of participatory citizenship in a society where so few have so much and so many are in need? And that issue, which is a thread throughout all of American history, comes to the forefront in the early 20th century, particularly in the cities and particularly here in New York.
In the months and years to come, as strikes and unrest swept the streets of Manhattan, New Yorkers would be forced to confront the greatest challenge of the industrial age. Would it be possible to close the gap between rich and poor in New York City and unite the dreams of capitalism and democracy? To do so would call for an effort far greater than that required to build bridges, subways, train stations, and skyscrapers, and require New Yorkers as never before to think of their city as a whole. Before it was over, the most harrowing tragedy of the industrial age would sear the city to its very soul, and then change life in New York and America forever.
I think there's a crisis that becomes sort of clear by the turn of the century, a crisis that's brought on partly by just the enormous swell of population, particularly in lower Manhattan, by the new immigration. We tend to forget that the vast majority of New Yorkers lived in tenements. Jacob Riis's other half was really the other two-thirds, or even the other three-quarters, if you want to think about it that way. And I think there are a lot of different political groups out there in various ways, all, I think, moving toward the same goal, namely how to get control of the city, how to make the city livable.
For almost 2 decades, the reform movement had been gathering momentum in New York. Ever since Jacob Riis's searing indictment, How the Other Half Lives, galvanized the conscience of a generation. Year after year, the movement widened, spurred on by socialist leaders, muckraking journalists, immigrant groups on the Lower East Side, and an increasing number of progressive politicians. In 1900, Riis's old friend, Theodore Roosevelt, now governor of New York, threw himself into the fight for housing reform. Before the year was out, the progressive politician had rushed a revolutionary housing bill through the New York State Legislature, the first of its kind in the country, outlawing the old tenements forever.
The progressives actually make some progress. I mean, they have consequences. Some of their greatest degree of progress come in public health. Now, New York City is a fabulous pioneer in developing public health services and clinics. There's a Bureau of Child Hygiene, which Dr. S. Josephine Baker establishes, which is the first in the world to send people out to help families get through pregnancies and child rearing. There are anti-tubercular campaigns. The city is a model and a pioneer in, again, developing a sense of entitlement to public health and, in fact, spreading it around.
By 1909, the progressive movement in New York had made critical advances in health and housing. But no force, it seemed, could penetrate the core of the city's industrial engine. The 30,000 factory floors and sweatshops, where each year 612,000 workers, most of them immigrants, were now turning out a tenth of the industrial output of the entire United States. The heart of that machine was New York's fiercely competitive garment industry, where each year 250,000 men, women, and children labored without regulation of any kind. 11 hours a day, 6 days a week, under brutal, dehumanizing, and often dangerous conditions.
You might be working a 16 to 20 hour day. You might be doing fine sewing without appropriate light, so you can't really see, and your eyes are very much taxed, if not destroyed. You are locked in to your space. You cannot go at will, for instance, to go to the bathroom. If you are sick, you may be fired, so you have to come in sick. And you're paid by the piece, which means that speed is everything and quality is by the boards.
In many shops and factories, conditions were nothing short of nightmarish. To increase productivity, shop foremen set brutal quotas, fired employees who lagged behind, docked the paychecks of anyone caught talking or humming on the job, and often locked the fire exits to keep out union organizers and to keep the women focused on their jobs.
We worked from sunrise to set, 7 days a week. Those who worked on machines had to carry them on their back to and from work. It was a regular slave factory. For talking, shop girls were immediately fired. The hissing of the machines, the yelling of the foreman, made life unbearable. Clara Lemlich.
The problem with the garment industry is that it is thousands of small businessmen, many of them recently garment workers themselves, who have opened up, a little a floor in a brownstone. In fact, require people to bring their own sewing machines with them, who pay next to nothing, and bid against one another for contracts from big garment manufacturers or department stores. So even with the best of will, if in fact you don't grind your workers down to the bare minimum, you're going to go out of business. It's the laissez-faire competitive market at its absolute worst.
Year after year, as the number of immigrants increased and conditions in the factories slowly worsened, reformers trooped up to Albany to plead with the state legislature, demanding that the government intervene. But nothing changed. Neither the reformers nor the fledgling Garment Workers Union could overcome the power of the factory owners or the hostility of the most powerful political organization in the city.
The stumbling block to all of this is Tammany Hall. Tammany Hall has been talking liberal, they've been talking union ever since the Henry George campaign, when they perceived a serious threat to their dominance. But nonetheless, they are basically in league with, in bed with big housing interests and real estate interests and manufacturing interests. They're not interested in rocking the boat.
When change started to come, it would begin in the most unlikely of places, with the most powerless of the city's long-suffering workforce, the impoverished teenage daughters of Southern Italian immigrants and Eastern European Jews. All through the summer of 1909, anger and frustration had been building amongst the young women. When a series of small strikes failed to make headway, the daring idea of a general strike, aimed not just at one manufacturer, but at the industry as a whole, began to take hold. On the evening of November 22nd, 3,000 women, most of them still in their teens, showed up for a mass meeting at the Great Hall of Cooper Union. As the night wore on, the union leaders, most of them men, continued to counsel caution, warning that a general strike would spark brutal reprisals from the owners. But then a member of the audience came forward, a frail 23-year-old seamstress and union activist named Clara Lemlich, so battered from a recent brawl on a picket line that she had to be helped to the platform. But once before the crowd, Her voice rose, and she spoke with mesmerizing fervor. "I am a working girl," she said in Yiddish, in a rush of words that no one present would ever forget. "One of those who are on strike against intolerable conditions. I am tired of listening to speakers who talk in general terms. I move that we go on a general strike. Now." The response was overwhelming. As Jewish workers translated Lemlich's words into English and Italian, the hall exploded into thunderous applause, and her motion was resoundingly endorsed. The next morning, 15,000 shirtwaist workers left their machines and manned the picket lines. Within days, they had been joined by 5,000 more.
Thousands and thousands left the factories from every side, all of them walking down toward Union Square. It was November. The cold winter was just around the corner. We had no fur coats to keep us warm. And yet there was the spirit that led us on and on. Pauline Newman.
"It is a conflict between employer and employees," one newspaper wrote, "not only unprecedented in its development, but also the largest strike of women ever known in the United States." On the picket lines, ill-clad young women stood shivering in the freezing rain and cold, huddling together for warmth. An equal number of men, one union official said, would never hold together under what these girls are enduring.
They're up against it because Tammany, for whatever its professions, is in fact sending the police. The police are arresting these folks in large numbers in very demeaning ways. They're in fact dragging off the women and calling them, as they are technically doing, walking up and down, streetwalkers, and they toss them in jail with hardened prostitutes and such.
By the third week of December, the union's financial resources were all but exhausted. When the flame of protest leapt from the ragged band of immigrant women to the wives and daughters of some of the richest men in the city.
Some of the picket lines contained women in minks as well as women in their shirtwaists, and it got a huge amount of publicity in the press and became a kind of cause célèbre in the city.
In the end, the uprising of the 20,000, the first great strike of the modern labor movement in New York, was doomed to failure as dwindling resources and bitter cold took their toll. But what Clara Lemlich and her sisters had started could never be undone. 3 months later, 60,000 members of the Cloakmakers Union went out, bringing the garment industry to a halt and forcing owners to the bargaining table in earnest.
The rising of the 20,000, 1909, 1910, really represents, I think, the first modern successful effort to unionize garment workers, particularly workers in so-called ladies' garments. It really is the genesis of the International Ladies' Garment Workers Union. It really marks a turning point, I think, as well in the emerging political power as well as union power of the immigrant working class.
But though the resulting settlement, called the Protocol of Peace, represented another step forward, few real concessions had been wrung from the factory owners. And some of the largest firms, like the Big Triangle Shirtwaist Company on the east side of Washington Square, had simply refused to sign the protocol at all. For all that had been accomplished, there was still no law regulating conditions in New York's factories, which by the spring of 1911 remained as brutal, unsanitary, and dangerous as ever. In the past year alone, 4 small fires had broken out in the building occupied by the Triangle Factory, whose owners still did nothing, pointing out that under the city code, their building was technically fireproof. Late on the afternoon of Saturday, March 25th, 1911, the 500 employees of the Triangle Shirtwaist Company were racing to fill their quotas. Teenage girls, for the most part, eager to finish up, collect their pay, and plunge into the mild spring evening. Around 4:45 p.m., with just 15 minutes left in the workday, someone on the 8th floor must have dropped a match or burning cigarette into the heaps of discarded fabric that littered the shop floor.
The Triangle Shirtwaist Factory occupied the top floors of a 10-story building, and a fire broke out. Apparently someone had dropped a cigarette into a drawer that held what they called remnants of scraps of cloth, and the fire spread pretty quickly, and the doors were locked, allegedly to keep out union organizers. This had been a company that resisted unionization, was trying to. So with this rapidly spreading fire, there was really very little way to get out, and the result was a horrible carnage.
Within seconds, the combustible litter of cloth and tissue paper had burst into flames, and before anyone could stop it, the fire began to spread with startling speed from one stack of fabric to another, as cries of panic went out and terrified workers scrambled for the exits.
I heard somebody cry fire. I ran for the door on the Washington Place side. But the door was locked, and immediately there was a great jam of girls before it. Some girls were screaming. Some were beating the door with their fists. Some were trying to tear it open. Rosie Safran.
It was horrifying. It was a large loft in which the doors had been locked from the outside. And so when the fire began, the women working at the machines tried to get out of the exits, could not move the doors, and there are accounts of bodies being crushed up against the doors and of women trying to escape.
Most workers on the 10th floor managed to escape, helped to safety across an adjoining rooftop by students from New York University. Hundreds more made it down by elevator, 30 people at a time, jammed into cars meant to hold half that number. But by 4:55, the searing heat had forced the last of the elevators out of service. And with the fire now spreading from the 8th floor to the 9th, nearly 200 women remained trapped in the building with no means of escape. On the 8th floor, workers tried bravely to stop the fire, but the flames were too quick, and the water pressure in the fire hoses failed them. As the searing heat and smoke intensified, the factory floor became an incinerator. And as bodies piled up in front of the locked main exit, those who still could raced for a fire escape on the far western end of the building. Fewer than 20 women managed to get out before the rusted metal supports gave way, sending several workers plunging to their death and cutting off the last means of escape for all the others. With a wall of fire advancing on them, the terrified women moved to the open windows.
The girls behind us were screaming and crying. Several of them, as the flames crept closer, ran into the smoke, and we heard them scream as the flames cut their clothes. One little girl, who worked at the machine opposite me, cried out in Italian, "Goodbye, goodbye, Tessa Banani."
Outside on the street below, a huge crowd had gathered. The New York Fire Department had arrived within minutes of the call, rushing 35 vehicles to the scene, along with the most modern firefighting equipment in the country. But even the tallest ladder could go no farther than the 6th floor, 2 full stories below the burning factory floors, where tongues of flame could already be seen curling out of the windows.
The fire, of course, like any fire in Manhattan, could be spotted from blocks and blocks around because of the smoke. So there were big crowds on the streets below. And the fire had gone on long enough that people had also heard the word down on the Lower East Side and had come up to the village, waiting to see what would happen. And then it became apparent in this heart-gripping moment that no one could get out except if they jumped.
At 5:05, a laborer named Dominic Cardiani, pushing his wheelbarrow down Green Street, heard a muffled explosion, followed by the sound of breaking glass. Glancing up, he saw what he thought were dark bundles of clothes, sailing from an 8th floor window.
You know, you can hardly believe it when you read about it. I mean, imagine, from the 8th, 9th, and 10th floors of a building overlooking Washington Square Park, you know, first this great tongue of flame leaps out, you know, and passes by where there's some policemen said, oh, it was just a momentary accident. Then all of a sudden, one passerby said something that looked like a bale of old clothes comes plummeting down from the 8th floor and hits with this thud, which somehow seemed too loud for a bale of clothes, on the sidewalk. And someone said they must be throwing, and it was burning as it fell, they must be throwing out the burning bales of clothes. And then other bodies started to come down. People realized that young girls would go out on the ledge. The flames would be looming up behind them, and they'd jump, of course, to die. Some would try to cling to the ledge with their fingertips, but they couldn't. You have plummeting down to the street scores of burning dead bodies.
There was also an iron fence below, so some of the young women, when they jumped, were impaled on the iron fence. And people who saw it said that they never forgot it, that it was a sight that burned itself on the retina of the watchers.
William Shepard, a reporter for the United Press, called the story in as he watched from a payphone across the street.
I learned a new sound, more horrible sound than description can picture. It was the thud of a speeding, living body on a stone sidewalk. Thud. Dead. Thud. Dead. Thud. Dead. Thud. Dead. There was plenty of chance to watch them as they came down. The height was 80 feet. The first 10 thuds, deads, shocked me. I looked up, saw that there were scores of girls at the windows. The flames from the floor below were beating in their faces. Somehow I knew that they too must come down. I even watched one girl falling, waving her arms, trying to keep her body upright, until the very instant she struck the sidewalk. Then came the thud. Then a silent, unmoving pile of clothing and twisted, broken limbs. William Shepard.
By now, dozens of women at a time could be seen standing at the 8th and 9th floor windows, all but engulfed by the inferno. As those below watched in horror, groups of women, 3 and 4 at a time, grabbed each other by the hand, closed their eyes, and plunged off the building. They hit the pavement just like rain, a stunned fire chief named Edward Worth later testified. Frances Perkins, a 31-year-old advocate with the Consumers League, stood with her hand at her throat, helpless to stop the unfolding tragedy.
The nets were broken.
The firemen kept shouting for them not to jump. But they had no choice. The flames were right behind them. For by this time, the fire was far gone. Francis Perkins.
By 5:15, the scene on the street was a bedlam, as thousands of workers poured out of nearby factories and pressed against the barricades. Fire engine horses reared at the strong smell of blood, while police tried without success to control the crowd.
The floods of water from the fireman's hose that ran into the gutter were actually stained red with blood. I looked upon the heap of dead bodies, and I remembered these girls were shirtwaist makers. I remembered their great strike of last year, in which these same girls had demanded more sanitary conditions and more safety precautions in these shops. These dead bodies were the answer.
It was over in less than half an hour. Firemen inspecting the burned floors the next day found dozens of bodies. Charred, headless trunks, some still bent over the sewing machines. Among the remains, the inspectors found 11 engagement rings. In all, 146 people, teenagers for the most part, immigrant girls, some as young as 14, had died in the greatest industrial disaster in the city's history.
Some died of smoke inhalation, piled against the doors trying to get out. Some were burned to death, and some jumped out of the windows and died. 141 young women died. And of course, when the firemen finally enter that building, the dead bodies are heaped up against the doors because there were no fire exits, there was no safety precautions.
March 26, 1911. The remains of the dead. It is hardly possible to call them bodies, because that word would suggest something human. And there was nothing human about most of these. Were taken in a steady stream to the morgue for identification. The New York Times.
At a temporary morgue set up on a pier along the East River, relatives lined up to identify the corpses. The ghastly process took 3 full days. Seven bodies were so badly burned, they could not be identified. And on April 5th, 1911, a mass funeral was held for the unknown victims. 120,000 working people joined in the procession, despite a heavy rain, while 400,000 more watched silently from the sidewalk.
A mass emotion of sorrow and despair was felt everywhere that day. But in the weeks that followed, these emotions gave way to angry questioning and a determination that a similar tragedy must never take place in New York again.
A few months later, the owners of the Triangle Factory, Isaac Harris and Max Blank, were tried for manslaughter, having locked their workers in. But to the shocked disbelief of the victims' families, and of most New Yorkers, the 2 men were acquitted when the prosecution was unable to prove that they had actually known that the exit door was locked at the exact time of the fire.
There was a trial, and the trial found that the owners were not guilty, for they had broken no law. Yes, they might not have been very nice to have locked in these young women, but there was no law, and so there was no repercussion.
Within weeks, the Triangle factory had reopened in a nearby building. Visiting the new plant, fire inspectors found the exit door blocked by rows of sewing machines. But now, something extraordinary began to occur. From the ashes of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire would begin to arise one of the most dramatic and far-reaching political transformations in American history.
It was a kind of a moment that the city could no longer ignore the reality that had been with the city for decades of what a sweatshop was. The whole city felt involved in those bodies that were thudding to the pavement. I mean, you couldn't say they don't relate to us. The impact of this one fire, the horror of the bodies, the number of the dead, had an impact that transformed. It was a turning point in the fight for social welfare legislation in New York.
The Triangle Fire catastrophe, it's an epic event in the dynamics of the city's politics and economy and everything else. In the immediate aftermath, what happens is a mass meeting of concerned citizens. A lot of officials in business put together an operation and go up to the state legislature and say, you've got to do something about this. We need reform legislation to police the workplace and make sure that nothing like this ever happens again.
The key to change lay with the New York State Legislature. The key to the legislature, however, lay in the pocket of Silent Charlie Murphy, the inscrutable, taciturn boss of Tammany Hall, and the last man in New York from whom reformers could expect any help. But the reformers were wrong.
Silent Charlie was an extremely shrewd politician, and he understood that the demographics of the city were changing, that you couldn't simply win by appealing to the Irish vote, that you had to make some attempt to draw in Jews, Italians, other new immigrants, that you had to worry about competing politicians, particularly Socialist Party, and also progressive Republicans, that you had all these people now in settlement houses and progressive reformers who were also a part of the political scene. And I think that what Murphy understood was that somehow Tammany had to adapt to the new realities of the city, the new political realities.
To the amazement of the reformers, whose efforts had been stymied by Tammany at every turn, Murphy supported the call for an investigation, then placed two of his closest protégés on it. Robert F. Wagner Sr., the leader of the state Senate, and 38-year-old Al Smith, now head of the state assembly. The grueling 4-year-long factory investigation that ensued would make Smith's career and change forever life in New York. Week after week, month after month, the Factory Commission ground on, taking testimony from fire inspectors, sanitation experts, health officials, and labor leaders. Calling in its first year alone more than 200 witnesses, then launching an unprecedented statewide tour of factories, beginning with New York.
This Factory Commission started to tour the state. And the reformers couldn't help noticing that no matter how hard the trip was, everyone would miss one trip or another. Al Smith never missed a trip. They couldn't help noticing his face when they would go to these factories and they'd see these rooms without a window in which mothers with their children worked 7 days a week. They remembered going to one factory where the owner assured him he had no children working, and then someone pointed them to an elevator, and he had put all the children in an elevator and put it between floors so nobody would see them. Then it came time for the Factory Commission to write its laws. And Smith sat at the table. He was very conscious of his lack of education. And he said, you make the recommendations, I'll fight for them. And it was a very wonderful and dramatic thing. The reformers had gone up to Albany for years and had never gotten these proposals for child labor laws, for women's labor laws, for wages and hours laws, for factory compensation, for disability compensation passed. Now they sat up there in the galleries of the assembly, and down there on the floor was this man they despised, fighting for them and getting these things through. And for the years to come after that, Al Smith was the weapon of reform in New York. He was the red-faced, loud-voiced, paunchy Tammany henchman who got through the dreams of social welfare reforms for which reformers had been dreaming now ever since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution.
The resulting flood of legislation, one man later said, was nothing less than epoch-making. Landmark laws affecting not only fire protection, but every aspect of factory life. Plant owners would now be required to provide enclosed staircases, fire sprinklers, and adequate lighting, ventilation, and washrooms. Dangerous machinery would be regulated by law. Women would not be allowed to work more than 54 hours a week. Children under 14 would not be allowed to work in factories at all.
And the logjam is broken. And what you get in 1913 is a flood of progressive legislation. At the heartland of it all is indeed safety regulations. But there's a tremendous raft of new laws, and Wagner and Smith are at the heartland of this. They introduce something like 60 bills, of which 56 get passed. And the political center of gravity of the city and the state, as a consequence, is profoundly shifted.
Business interests were outraged. To own a factory in New York is now a calamity, the leaders of the real estate board declared. But nothing could stop the momentum of the campaign Al Smith was now leading, with almost evangelical fervor, to use the power of the state to change people's lives.
In other words, politics is not simply now about helping people out when they're in need, or giving them the coal to get through the winter, or helping them get a job when they're unemployed. It's now about using the power of the state government to really get at some of the underlying problems of city life. The point here is that machine politicians find that it's in their own interest to begin to think about politics in a less parochial way, and ultimately in a more national way. What can we do when we control the city or the state or the Congress to make people's lives better? How can we improve working conditions? How can we improve housing conditions? How can we improve educational opportunities?
As the subway had brought New Yorkers together physically, so the grief and horror of the Triangle Fire brought them together emotionally and spiritually. We banded ourselves together, Frances Perkins later wrote, moved by a sense of stricken guilt, to prevent this kind of disaster from ever happening again. In the years to come, as the leaders of the Factory Investigating Commission moved into positions of power in City Hall, in Albany, and eventually in Washington, the remarkable alliance would become an unstoppable engine for change, not only in New York, but across the nation. Looking back, Frances Perkins, appointed by Franklin D. Roosevelt as the first Secretary of Labor, and the first woman cabinet member in American history, would say simply, the New Deal began on March 25th, 1911, the day the Triangle Factory burned.
Is New York the most beautiful city in the world? It is not far from it. No urban nights are like the nights there. I have looked down across the city from high windows. It is then that the great buildings lose reality and take on magical powers. Squares and squares of flame, set and cut into the ether. Here is our poetry, for we have pulled down the stars to our will. Ezra Pound, 1913.
By 1913, anything seemed possible in New York. At 7:30 precisely, on the evening of April 24th, President Woodrow Wilson pressed an electric switch in the White House. 200 miles to the north, on the corner of Broadway and Park Row in New York, the 80,000 electric lights of a brand new skyscraper, the Woolworth Building, blazed out brilliantly across the city. It looked, one man said, like an immense ball of fire, giving the effect of a gorgeous jewel, resplendent in its setting of rich gold, and visible to mariners 40 miles out to sea. Rising 60 stories and nearly 800 feet into the sky, the tallest building in the world by far was immediately called the Cathedral of Commerce.
You had a new building form achieving for the first time a kind of artistic power of its own, more even than the Flatiron Building, which is so very important. One of the great American buildings of all time. A building like none other that had ever been built before, paid for by Mr. Woolworth in cash, $13 million, all from his 5 and 10 cent stores. A lot of nickels and dimes.
5 years later, New Yorkers proved anything was possible. On the night of November 5th, 1918, Al Smith, the Irish boy from the 4th Ward of the Lower East Side, who had grown up in the shadow of the Brooklyn Bridge, and whose only degree was from the Fulton Fish Market, sat anxiously in the ballroom of the Hotel Biltmore in New York, watching the election returns come in. By midnight, the results were clear. The 44-year-old hero of the labor reform movement had been elected governor of the largest and most important state in the Union.
When he won the governorship, it really meant something to the Irish in America. It was the first time an oath of office had ever been taken for the governor of state or the senator of the state in the accents of the old country. When Smith was inaugurated, all the night before, trains brought up to Albany the Irish immigrants. They marched all night through the streets singing this new two-step, which was Al Smith's hymn, The Sidewalks of New York. And when Smith took the oath of office up there, it was the triumph of the immigrants in America.
New York's working classes could not believe their good fortune. On the Lower East Side, jubilant immigrant voters, Irish and non-Irish alike, danced in the streets, while down in the 4th Ward, Smith's home district, housewives tied brooms to the railings of their tenement stoops, the old Tammany symbol for a clean sweep. In the years to come, no politician in New York history would do more than Al Smith to make government answerable to the needs of all the people, and help make the great democratic vista Walt Whitman had once seen on the streets of New York a reality.
Whitman sang of the immigrants. Smith talked of the immigrants. He talked in different, it was us against them. He always said, there are no votes over on 5th Avenue. They're all down here in the 4th Ward where I live. He was turning the force of the immigrant flood. He was channeling the governmental institutions, the policies of the state to meet their needs and make them a part, you might say, of the fabric of the city. Smith had never read Whitman, you can be sure of that, but he was going to be the guy who, in effect, put Whitman's verses into a political slogan, because it was Alfred E. Smith who said, the cure for the evils of democracy is more democracy.
Visit New York online. Jump into a taxi and play a quiz game. Visit a virtual New York. And for teachers and parents, take your kids on a learning adventure through your town. PBS Online at pbs.org.